Welcome, everyone. My name's Patricia Kranz. I'm the Executive Director of the OPC, and we're delighted today to honor the winners of the Kim Wall Award. This is about the 17th program I think we've had honoring winners through virtual programs because, of course, we couldn't have an in-person awards dinner this year. And the winners of the Kim Wall Award are the New York Times team that produced the Russia tapes, Healthcare and Civilians Under Attack in Syria. And the Kim Wall Award honors the best story or series of stories on international affairs using creative and dynamic digital storytelling techniques, which are becoming more and more important every day. Malachi Brown, the senior producer, is here, and the head judge of this award will be talking to him, and that is Louise Rogue, executive editor, international at HuffPost. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Patricia. And hi, Malachi. How are you doing?
Louise, hi, Patricia. Thanks. We're good. We're good. We're crazy times at the moment in every newsroom, I think, in the States.
Well, I do want to talk about what you're working on at the moment, especially with the Capitol Hill being overrun and that work. But we can come back to that because first, let's talk about Syria. And I think, the New York Times is, from what I know, one of the few newsrooms that has the kind of capabilities that you have with the kind of forensic visual investigations. And I think people will probably be interested in hearing a little bit about your methods and how you approach a story. And maybe we could start there. So with the Syria story, where did it start? Did it start with you guys having material? Or did you start with saying, like, hey, we got to figure out who's responsible for these bombings in Syria?
It started out actually really at the outset of this team, way back in 2017, April or May 2017, and in a 5-week period there was an intense military assault in Syria, and it was a statistic that ran across my Twitter feed. Really, was that under some statistics, a medical facility was attacked once every 29 hours over that 5-week period, which is an incredible assault on healthcare in those areas. And it was a curiosity, about that and digging into it and seeing if we could document it and figure out who was doing it. And we had a few false starts with that, and news took over, and military campaigns waned and increased again over the time. But we really, it was about a year later where we started observing the same thing in Yemen, and I think things got so bad in that period that the United Nations Security Council actually passed a unanimous resolution, reinforcing the Geneva Conventions that protect healthcare in conflict. Laws of war that are hundreds of years old, and were at risk of being eroded, that red line being eroded, and these types of attacks being normalized. Anyway, so that's sort of the long backdrop to it. We had done a piece focusing on hospitals in Yemen and how US and how the Saudi led Air Force were just failing at every turn, and American efforts to try to steer them on the right course were failing, and yet America was continuing to supply them. And then in that, while we were reporting and producing that, there was another military campaign in Idlib that picked up steam, and there again, hospitals it appeared to be deliberately attacked, because with each of these military campaigns, the data that we had gathered and the people that we had spoken to up to this point, you notice a big uptick on attacks on hospitals at the same time that they're attacking other civilian infrastructure from the air. And so if it's attacks from the air, it has to be either Russia or Syria. So we just started documenting each of those attacks very specifically. As you know, Syria is the most documented war, on social media and visual material, and that's our specialty. And so we started documenting a lot of that stuff. And we also had a lot of background information and spreadsheets and databases from the likes of Physicians for Human Rights. And we had, looked into the different ways in which hospitals are attacked, the different types of weapons that are being used. And so that was the starting point. But in all of that evidence, it was very difficult to assign responsibility for individual specific attacks to specific Air Force or parties. The rebels in the area also were responsible for attacking some medical facilities, but nothing on the scale of the Syrians and the Russians.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the Russians were denying that they had anything to do with it, or commenting. Just for a little bit of contextualization, that those hospitals in Idlib, for example, I mean, were they overground hospitals clearly marked? What is? Give us a little bit of a flavor of what it looks like on the ground.
Yeah, some of them. I mean, we interviewed many doctors and hospital workers and people in the areas. I mean, some of them were known hospitals supported by the Syrian government prior to the war. And so there's no excuse that they should be bombed. Others were perhaps, makeshift hospitals that originally were made overground. But as the air campaign intensified, they were forced to dig underground. And in fact, some of the hospitals are relocated away from civilian areas. So often were they attacked, along with bakeries and other infrastructure. They said, we better build these places in bunkers outside of the town, away from civilians. And so some of them were underground. Other ones are, in the basements of existing ones. But in the earlier days, they were, standing above ground, maternity hospitals, you name it. Mm-hmm. In Aleppo, I mean, there was just an inordinate number in really densely populated areas attacked. And we interviewed, one of the Dr. Hamza, who's in the Forsama film, that brilliant film, horrific film. About the day that one of the days that the hospital that he operated was attacked.
So just again, like contextually, so we have a very deliberate campaign here carried out by, we suspect, Russians, but they're denying responsibility, and it's hard to kind of prove anything. And yes, there are people in the ground, eyewitnesses and so on, but not that many journalists or not from Western organizations. You then gather all this visual material, but one of the things that's striking about the investigation is also you have the radio communication of the pilots. How did you get that?
Yeah, there was, as we're investigating each incident, we're talking to witnesses about them. And often when you're talking to Syrians who are so familiar with this, they'll say, well, we know, of course it was a Russian aircraft, or of course it was a Syrian aircraft. How do you know? And I remember one filmmaker who made The Cave. He came in and we interviewed him for us, and he said it's the Russian aircraft. They sound like the dragons from the Game of Thrones. There's this enormous scream as they come in and they launch their attacks, but also the power of their weaponry. They have the ability to launch bunker busters and to really do serious damage. So there was that. Evidence, but we didn't have any hard evidence. In one of the incidents, there was a source who told us, well, we know it was Russians because we have recordings of them, carrying it out. And so then our ears picked up, and we knew about the spotter network in Syria. So because attacks were so frequent, there's a network of spotters that are listening into the open radio communications that Syrian and Russian pilots use. And they're also on the rooftops, and they're spotting and saying, police police in my mind, because of the race and policing in the States. But they're heading northwest, they're near Kafr Nabil, or they're circling around a certain town. And they would log that into a spreadsheet. And once they hit enter in the spreadsheet, it's automatically tweeted out or alerted on mobile phone apps and that sort of stuff. So we knew that information wasn't retrospective to fit a narrative that, oh yeah, Russia definitely attacked. These are live accounts. But they also started recording those radio communications, and we managed to obtain those. And the immense value in that is, A, you can hear the pilots communicating with ground control, receiving coordinates sometimes, and also every one of them is time-stamped to the second. And so the challenge for us became identifying the minute of these attacks, so that through our visual evidence, through WhatsApp messages that doctors are sending between each other, they just hit us, that kind of stuff, through photographs that are taken of the moment or immediately after the attack, and that are shared on social media, and turning these open sources into primary sources, who can share that evidence directly with us, with all of the file data that's embedded in it, and then do our sort of like, you're never using just one photograph. You're using multiple pieces of evidence to establish the time and relate what's happening on the ground with what pilots are flying in the air, where they were flying at that time, and who launched, which pilot launched a missile in those minutes.
So as you kind of create that narrative, you do what any journalists do anywhere, right? Like you find multiple sources to confirm the same fact, and cross-reference. Was that with the radio communication? Was that the breakthrough, or were there other things that you where you knew, okay, now we've got it?
The radio communications were the breakthrough, because we focused on again at the start of this campaign. There was a series of hospitals hit. I think there was 4 in one day on March 5th, or in a 12-hour period. And the UN were so appalled by that. Each of these hospitals were on their no strike list, that they actually named the hospitals. They usually don't do that. And they said something has to be done. So we started looking through all of the audio files for that. And of course, in our spreadsheet, we had the coordinates and the locations and the media and all the rest of it for these attacks. We were already looking into them. And at one point in the day, Dmitry, our Russian video editor, he's the video editor of the whole project, but he's also a native Russian speaker. He's saying, I've got coordinates here. He bangs them over to Evan Hill. Evan Hill checks the coordinates, and he stands up. He's like, we've got them, because the coordinates matched exactly one of the hospitals that they had bombed. And so that was a slam dunk. The other ones, they didn't always share coordinates, but they did have a pattern by which they would prepare and launch the attack. So often they would receive the coordinates electronically, or it would be pre-programmed in before they took off on their launch, pre-identified on their mission. And they would be talking to ground control and say, okay, I've got coordinates. I need a correction on that coordinate. Got the correction. I'm going to bomb in this minute. And then they get, okay, you've got to go ahead. And then they'll launch it, and they'll launch it in the minute. And so, that's what we were doing. We're matching each one of those launches up with the visual material and the attacks on the hospitals. And for instance, there's one pilot. Often the Russians, because they're using precision bombs, the Syrians will sometimes come in and just let a load of bombs go, and they'll like scatter along. The Russians will very often drop one. Sometimes they'll drop several, but they'll drop one, circle around, drop it again, circle around, and drop it again at the exact same point. And that's what happened with Kafr Nabil a few times. And each one is 5 minutes apart, and that same pilot is up there saying, coming around for a second one, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes.
And just like, why would that be? Why is that a tactic?
I don't know. I mean,
because it seems like you've already got people, injured, scrambling, and
I mean, they call them double taps, and again, the whole tactic here is to really terrorize the civilian population into submission. And if you think about hospitals in particular as like the final sanctuary for communities, if you're keeping people away from healthcare and you're scaring them away from healthcare, then because you think you could be killed, even if it's an underground hospital, that's a tactic. I think, bringing in this is what happened in Marat al-Numan. They bombed a commercial area, and you have first responders flooding to the scene to pull people out from the debris, and next thing another bomb comes down in the exact same location. And again, it's a heinous tactic that is part of just the terror that they're inflicting on these populations.
So you gather all this material, and I shudder to think about how big your spreadsheets are, because I imagine that they must be like enormously complex. But you have all this material. How do you sift through it? Do you have any technology? So is it just like hard labor, or how do you sift through all the materials?
In this case, it was hard labor. I mean, it was a good organizing sort of principle, and one of our data engineers, Boy, came and helped us organize the spreadsheets as well. And basically, we were able, on a particular time code, we were able to sort of like cross-reference all of the information that we had. But I can show you some of the spreadsheets. Actually, I've got a slide here. But you know, basically, you know, cross-organizing all of the data and the evidence that we had for each attack, and then, you know, cross-referencing it across multiple different pieces of information. And then things like, you know, security contacting the source of that content, as I say, because what we're trying to get is the raw media, the original file from the original device, because that will have the metadata, which for us, it could be coordinates, but it more importantly, the hour, minute, and second that the video was recorded, and CCTV camera inside, camera footage from inside hospitals and stuff like that as well. And then there might be discrepancies because different camera's setting might be off, or, you know, the CCTV system might be off, and that happened to us a few times. And so what we would do is we'd call up somebody at the hospital and say, okay, can you show us, you know, point the camera at the clock in your camera system at the moment and wait for it to change minute, and we'd note that down, or we'd ask them to hold their iPhone up to match their iPhone time, or our time with their camera time, and basically calculate the difference. And anyway, so there's a little bit of a yardstick stuff that you need to do there to get the precise minute.
But so the metadata serves both to kind of report the story and to illuminate the story, but also in some ways to validate the material itself, right?
Exactly.
To make sure that you've got the right stuff and it's not, you know, in some way fabricated or.
Exactly, or it's an old photograph that's recirculated as, you know, a fresh attack, or that sort of stuff. But as you said at the start, you know, there's often multiple cameras. I remember the Cafarnabal attack, or one of there were two attacks in Cafarnabal Hospital that we documented, and in the second one, there's two guys who run towards a rooftop, pull out their phones, and they capture the second and third strikes on the hospital. And in one video, you can see that there's a guy in front of him who's also filming the same thing. And so when we got in touch with the first source, we asked him who was with you, get in touch with them, and then get their camera media, then get in touch with the hospital and get their CCTV. And so you're cross-referencing all of those plus the pilot information.
So like a lot of
recordings.
Really complex triangulation there. And then, so like it's both finding also the people and harvesting or reporting the material. I want to come back and talk a little bit about Brianna and what happened at the Capitol, but I want to also hear about your team and your background, because I know you had a background at Storyful and an interesting background before you came to the New York Times, and then you set up this team, which is quite unusual within journalism. Talk to me a little bit about what were some of your thoughts in like bringing together that team and the things you were looking for in the team members and who you have on your team.
Yep. I came to the Times in 2016. I came from a startup that unfortunately is no longer around called Reportedly, and that was you know, a group of journalists led by Andy Carvin, formerly of NPR, who, you know, was very much a Twitter voice of the, you know, during the Arab Spring, and trying to in real time figure out what was going on through these networks, and kind of applying that same principle of you know, sourcing knowledge from the crowd, and figuring things out, sometimes in real time. Sometimes we would get leads and we would go off and spend 2 or 3 weeks on a short investigation, but using sort of, again, networks of sources and Twitter lists and our ability to kind of trawl through the open web. Prior to that, I was with Storyful, as you say, which is a social media news agency. And that was very much applying similar techniques in a breaking news context, with the idea being that cameras take a while to get to events in the public interest, and often eyewitnesses are recording this stuff. And if you can verify that material and get the right credits, or even license the footage on the behalf of somebody, then of somebody who's documenting something, then you're selling a sort of a layer of trust in this unknown sort of, it was then an unknown sort of medium for a lot of newsrooms. So fast forward to the New York Times, and we tried to introduce some of that, those principles to the video unit back then, in a sort of a breaking news context. I don't know if you remember, 2016 was, of course you remember, 2016 was also a very big breaking news year, with attacks in Europe and various different events, Israel too. But eventually we saw the opportunity to do deeper investigations, and that happened in sort of spring 2017, I suppose, about 9 months maybe after I started. And yeah, so we did a couple of investigations into chemical weapons attack in Syria, that time that President Erdogan's goons beat up protesters in DC after a meeting with Trump. And then the masthead in the New York Times took an interest and said, okay, had a meeting, explained the reporting, show us, all of the sort of how you pull this together. And then they were like, oh, so it's just reporting. And so I was like, yeah, it's just a different type of reporting, different source information. And we're like, okay, so what do we need to do to build this team? And so then we set about identifying talent for that. And one of the first person onto the reporting team was Barbara Marcellini. And she came in via an internship. Brazilian journalist, speaks 5 languages, was doing a master's in New York in video journalism, was spending her days off in Storyful. And so she had like all of the skills, and is also had reporting experience from Brazil, and was a great addition to the team, and is still on the team. Then Christoph Kuttel, who's an Austrian expert in satellite imagery analysis, but also had started using that in investigations with open source, with crowdsourced media and open source media. And me and Christoph knew each other for a few years prior. And then the team built from there. I think the next person on the team was Christian Trebert from Bellingcat, who I had met that summer that we set up the team. And then he eventually came and joined us from the Netherlands. And then who else? Evan Hill, Haley Willis. Evan Hill was a Middle East correspondent. He was one of the reporters on the Russia tapes along with Christian. Anyway, so the team just like slowly built from there. And now we're a team of 15 people, I think 16 people, about 8 of us are immigrants. And so there's a good mix of folks there.
So that is actually like a perfect segue over to a question here from somebody in the audience, Bill Holstein, who's asking, now that the Times has developed this visual forensic team, how do you coordinate with the news desks that have traditionally dominated the paper's coverage of the world and the nation, of course? Do you coordinate? Do you work with the foreign desk on this project? Did you work with any of the Times correspondents in the region?
On this particular project, for the main pieces in it, we didn't work. We led the reporting on that and the production of those stories, and of course we lean on our colleagues in the newsroom in Beirut, in Turkey, whenever we needed to, and they're extremely collegial and helpful. And then there are other projects where we do team up. An investigation into an attack on protesters by the military in Nigeria, the Sarsi teamed up with us and a reporter that she was working with on a freelance basis, Emmanuel Akinwotu, and he went there with a camera crew to the location. So that was one. The Khashoggi stuff, we teamed up with Ben Hubbard and David Kirkpatrick. And yeah, so story by story, sometimes we'll team up. Today, we produced a reconstruct of what happened in Washington, D.C. last week in conjunction with the graphics desk. It's more of an interactive than a video. But what we really wanted to do was build that specialist reporting ability within our team, along with all of the really talented story producers, video editors, motion graphics editors that are on the team as well.
It's also about like teaching other people like what you're doing, and in some ways like maybe spreading those skills or like that way of thinking in terms of reporting.
Yeah, in some ways, and some reporters on different desks are really adept at that. Like I think of Megan Specia, she's great at that and has a keen eye for opportunities like that. And she's on the foreign desk. She's in London at the moment, and so she often leads those types of stories independently in print.
Great. I have two more questions just coming up on time here, but the Breonna Taylor reconstruction, the shooting of Breonna Taylor, was a remarkable piece of work. Can you talk a little bit about that and what went into that and sort of the fallout from that?
Yes. So the idea behind this came when obviously Breonna Taylor was killed during a botched raid by the police on her apartment last March. Really high profile story, and controversial because of how the police approached what happened, the charges that they brought against her boyfriend at the time, but also that they didn't wear or they didn't use body cameras. In fact, two of the officers, one of them had a body cam, the other was rigged to wear a body cam, but none of the others were even rigged. So there's no video evidence of what happened, and so it was sort of very much a he said she said type of a scenario between the boyfriend who was inside, who was a survivor, and the cops on the outside. And at issue here was like, how did this go so wrong, and how did it escalate so quickly? And what was shock. So anyway, so there was that. So we had little to work with until we got access to a trove of photographs, crime scene photographs, floor plans and other stuff. And it was really shocking to see just how many bullets they fired so quickly that riddled almost every room in her apartment. And so the question was like, how the hell could this happen? And what happened really? And even though there were no cameras there, the holes in walls and ceilings and through walls and into other walls and through windows into walls and into everyday household objects allowed us to retrace the trajectories of those bullets and put, officers in certain places. And then also some of the officers were interviewed immediately after, some in the days or weeks after, who were involved, their testimony also, and the testimony of the boyfriend who was inside as well, allowed us to do the job that the body cameras would have done and basically recreate what happened and the screw ups along the way as we investigated it as well. I should say that there's great reporting by our Times colleagues, but also the Louisville Courier-Journal, who've been on this case from the beginning, and Vice News have also done really good work incrementally on this. But we wanted to sort of like visualize it, because anybody I spoke to about it, they still didn't really fully understand, what had happened, and was there a drug dealing boyfriend who was in there? Didn't he fire at the cops, and wasn't there a firefight and things like that? So that was the impetus for it, to try to recreate it. And I think a lot of people appreciated it. They kind of felt like that it really explained visually what went down, and left an indelible sort of impression upon them. So that was it. And then in our analysis, you're looking at, there's one, so just again, going back to the story, they ram into her door after 45 seconds, policeman steps into the breach. The apartment is entirely dark. At this stage, Brianna and her boyfriend are walking towards the door, and because the police, they didn't know it was the police, and they think an intruder is trying to ram in the door, he grabs his handgun and he shoots down and shoots one of the cops in the leg. And what we're trying to do in the reconstruction is simulate that environment, and you can do that with 3D modeling. And where if you put the ceiling on, you can see how dark it is inside there, and the fact that the cops are silhouetted. The only light is behind them. They're not using flash lamps, any of that. So a cop gets hit in the leg, he returns fire, takes cover, returns 2 more rounds, and then takes cover again and gets out of there. But meanwhile, another of his colleagues steps in and then just sprays the place and stops only when his weapon stops him from firing. And he's the guy who fired the fatal shots. And then another police officer runs to the front and fires 10 rounds in through 2 windows, and he can't see through the windows. He can't see who's behind the windows. And so just explaining all of that in 3D, I think was the goal.
Yeah, I mean, it was an extraordinary experience, because even if you'd read all the coverage, like really being in the room and seeing and being in the space, I think was you got a very different understanding of what had happened, and how irresponsibly the cops had at best had behaved really irresponsibly. And part of it, right? Like the next day, or there was like, the next day.
Oh yeah.
After the piece came out.
That's right. I mean, like listening to the testimony, the Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, at the time, the charges were levied against the officer who fired from the front through the windows, but not against the officers who fired into the hallway where Brianna was. He said that they were justified in their use of force. But in talking to legal experts and former police officers, and even, the SWAT commander, listening to his testimony, SWAT commander who arrived after the fact, it's far more complicated than that. That if there are intelligence failures in your preparation for it, if you're told you shouldn't execute that search warrant without the SWAT team, and you shouldn't be doing simultaneous warrants, but yet you'd go ahead and do it, that you don't clearly announce yourself that you're police there when you're breaking in somebody's door. And then the fact that one of the 2 officers who were firing into the door does so blindly, and he, in his own words, says he couldn't hear anything, he couldn't see anything, and if you told me I didn't fire my weapon, I'd believe you. And he fires 16 rounds in seconds in there, and he's the guy who kills her. That seems to us to be excessive use of force, and that was what we were trying to convey. And the following day, the new police chief agreed with that assessment and sent a letter of termination to that officer. And so that was the first time the police department kind of fessed up, saying, yeah, this was a monumental screw up in terms of her death.
I know we're at time, but I have 2 more questions. One is, obviously the mob overrunning the Capitol last week. That was an enormously photographed and filmed event by the participants themselves. And I imagine, like you mentioned, that you had a piece in this morning with the graphics department. Are you working on other things? Are you reconstructing other things?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of so much material. I mean, the more I look at what happened and the videos that are emerging day after day, it's a I don't know what's the word to use, but it's an incredible event, and it's really sort of horrifying, actually, because of the violence that was happening in certain places, and the threat of violence. Yeah, so we're collecting all of that, we're analyzing it, we're breaking out stories as we go. I think there's a lot more reporting to do on it. We're identifying, protagonists in the footage by name, but some we don't have names yet for. So there are lots of spreadsheets running, and there are lots of people contributing to our spreadsheets, and so there'll be more to come. But yeah, check out the reconstruction that the graphics test did with our team today. And I'm sure there'll be more reporting that comes out in the coming weeks. What's interesting about this is the crowd assaulting and chasing away the media, and yet documenting this from every possible angle at the same time and incriminating themselves. So I think there's plenty of material for us to work with.
So if you are a journalist or an editor or something at a smaller paper, somebody who's like really interested in what you guys have been doing and really like what you're doing, but maybe don't have the resources to have like 15, 16 people come together as a team, is there anything you could do, or what would be your kind of advice to somebody like that?
There are ways to take this approach to breaking news, but also to other events. And the value of this is that if you get your verification practices down and you include that in your reporting, it's transparent. And I think that's important for our viewers in maintaining trust in media, which has been eroding over the last while. But it can be very explanatory of these chaotic events that happen. And that there are ways to do it where you don't need a really big, sophisticated media video production. You can do it as interactives with clips kind of embedded and stuff like that. If you write to the material in that way, look at some of the work that the Wall Street Journal is starting to do. They put out a visual investigation today, and the Washington Post have a small team with Dalton Bennett and Joyce Lee, and they're not as big as our team, but they're doing some really good journalism. Bellingcat, of course. They take a different approach in presentation, and it's really detailed and in the weeds. But yeah, there are ways to do it. And BBC Africa Eye have done some really good investigations as well along these with producers teamed up with like one or two specialists in this type of area. So.
Okay, I actually lied, because there's one more question. It's another question from the audience. It's also Phil Holstein. It's like a couple of questions rolled into one, but what's the newest, most exciting technology you're working on incorporating into your work? And where does all this lead? Do you feel like you're reinventing journalism?
I think this is all kind of just a rich new source of evidence is the way I view it. And it's not a reinvention, it's kind of applying the same journalistic principles to this new material. But there's also really rich storytelling in that material as well, or the possibility of doing that. What was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Technologies, is there a new?
Oh, technologies. Yeah, I mean, there's new tech coming on all of the time. Like if you look, part of the inspiration for this are groups like Forensic Architecture and Situ Research, who are in Brooklyn, and some of the stuff that Human Rights Watch have done in past days, where you're really putting material into its full context. Situ have modeled streets where they bring you in and they show you the camera angle of the footage of protests in New York this year. They've done the same in Timbuktu for judicial bodies where there are war crimes. Forensic Architecture actually did a reconstruction when there was no video of the killing of Mark Duggan in London, and that was partially the inspiration for our Brianna reconstruction, that it's possible, even if the video isn't there, to put people where they said they were and look at trajectories and stuff like that. So I think the 3D space, the augmented reality space, I think the use of LiDAR and those types of tools, photogrammetry, are the next sort of progressions of this stuff. And they are methods that we're tinkering around with. If you think about augmented reality, for instance, if you have an architect or a graphics reporter who can create the inside of a prison, for instance, as Forensic Architecture did, and put a witness or a former inmate into that environment through augmented reality, provided it's not going to re-traumatize them, it might elicit more granular and more detailed witness testimony, for instance. Those are types of things that I think might be used into the future.
It sounds super interesting, and this has been really interesting, Malachy. Ultimately, I do think it is, as your editor, or I don't know if it was Dean or who said it, but like that this is ultimately reporting, right? It is like, you have a lot of fancy tools, but ultimately it's about doing due diligence and like checking your sources and reporting. It
is, and it's we feel incredible responsibility to get the facts right. And we think we have the opportunity to like nail down little factoids and build them into like an indisputable picture of something, which I think helps to kind of cut through BS on and contested narratives around certain events. So
Great. Well, thank you so much, Maliki, for taking the time. I know you're super busy. You have a bunch of and images to get back to and video. So thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Louise. Thanks, Patricia, also.
Thanks
for
to
having us.
both of you. And it seems like you're doing the work of law enforcement at this point to surface all these things and names. And I mean, of course, a lot of journalists are doing it, but
Yeah.
you wonder, you know, where's law enforcement in all of this at the Capitol? But anyway, that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. And it was fascinating.
Thanks very much.
Okay, take
care. All the best, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.